In 2005 or 2006, progressive neocon talk radio host Michael Medved had American Indian author Sherman Alexie on his show. Alexie remarked that it's a truism that American Indians vote Democrat but live Republican lives. In essence, he was saying that American Indians are conservative Democrats, like Ronald Reagan. Reagan said that he did not leave the Democratic Party, but that the party left him. The party changed as progressive neoliberals took over. Ironically, during Reagan's presidency, the same thing happened to the Republican Party as progressive neoconservatives took over his administration. Progressives believe in big government. Whereas Reagan said that big government is the problem, progressives believe that big government is the solution. Progressives on the left believe that we can solve social problems with big government programs. Progressives on the right believe that we can solve foreign relations problems with big government. And progressives on both the left and the right believe that we can solve economic problems with big government. The status of American Indians is such that we have a more intimate relationship with the federal government than most other Americans. As an American, I am a citizen of the city of Olympia, the state of Washington, and the United States. But as an American Indian, I am also a citizen of the Cowlitz Indian tribe, which subjects me to a very complex and often contradictory set of laws that place me under the plenary power, or universal power, of Congress. The stereotype is that this exempts me from income taxes, property taxes, and sales taxes, but that's a false stereotype. Indian reservations are federal reserves, like military bases. They're owned by the federal government, and as such are not subject to state and county property and sales taxes and laws, but are subject to federal laws. So Indians living on reservations do not pay property and sales taxes, and if I remember right, Indians who live and work on reservations also do not pay income taxes, but I could be mistaken about that. Regardless, this seems unfair to a lot of people, and conservatives and classical liberals on the right will often rail against this unfairness. Generally, they fight against this by demanding that Indians be treated just as badly as everybody else. Were it up to me, I would instead join with libertarians to demand that everybody else gets to be treated just as well as Indians, at least where the absence of taxation on reservations is concerned. Same thing with regard to Indian casinos. President Reagan signed into law the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act of 1987, allowing Indian tribes, not individual Indians, but tribal governments, to operate gaming on reservations. This reservation gaming is limited by the kind of gaming that is allowed in the rest of the state. So, for example, Las Vegas-style slot machines are illegal in the state of Washington. Hence, none of the tribal casinos are allowed to operate Las Vegas-style slot machines. But lotteries are legal in the state of Washington. This includes what are called video lottery terminals, and that's what tribal casinos have. Personally, I can't see any difference between Las Vegas-style slot machines and video lottery terminals, but there you have it. The state of Washington runs different kinds of lotteries, tribal governments run casinos with video lottery terminals, and people throughout the state can legally engage in this kind of gambling. Me, I don't gamble. I play stock options. What's the difference? Not very much. In any case, Indians who live, work, buy, and sell in places other than on Indian reservations are subject to all the same taxes, rules, regulations, and laws as everybody else. Why? Shouldn't Indians be treated just like everybody else regardless of the location? Without giving it much thought, progressive neolibs on the left and also many libertarians will give a knee-jerk response about historic oppression and how society owes Indians for whatever somebody's ancestors did to American Indian ancestors. I think that's a load of hooey. It has nothing to do with historical oppression or intergenerational trauma, but about inheritance. For most American Indian tribes were never conquered. Some, a few were, but most were not. Most Indian tribes entered into negotiations with representatives of the federal government and signed treaties in which the tribes agreed not to kill your ancestors in exchange for considerations, including access to knowledge, technologies, and other compensations. After all, why would you want to keep cooking stew in laboriously crafted baskets when you could get a nice Dutch oven that would last for generations? These treaties were not between individual Americans and individual Indians, but between the federal government and Indian tribal governments. Governments endure for generations, and government-to-government relations endure for generations. Now, laws can change, and I think it's in his book, Suicide Pact, that Judge Andrew Napolitano outlines how presidential administrations since Eisenhower have been using the office of the president to trample legal protections and constitutional guarantees at an ever-accelerating pace. But it doesn't happen overnight. I'm just old enough to remember when General Dwight Eisenhower was president. And even at age 4, I could tell that he was disgusted with politics. Having served 3 terms as a tribal councilman, I am too. Politicians will spend hours hashing over decisions that any normal, sane human being will spend maybe 5 minutes on. And politics attracts the worst personalities and evokes the worst from the best. But I digress. Property rights are fundamental to the American Constitution and Bill of Rights. This includes the right to pass property from one generation to the next. Bill Gates, for example, when he was a boy, he inherited a trust fund from his maternal grandfather. Where many, if not most people, fritter away inherited money, he used it to start a business that eventually grew into Microsoft. Now he's one of the wealthiest people in the world, and his children will inherit some of that wealth. But with each succeeding generation, his descendants will be less Bill Gates. That is, their Bill Gates blood quantum will be diluted. At some point, will the Bill Gates bloodline be so diminished that for inheritance purposes they should no longer be considered Gates and no longer allowed to inherit? In order to continue inheriting whatever is left of the Bill Gates fortune, should Bill Gates' descendants be expected to intermarry, cousins marrying cousins, in order to maintain their Bill Gates blood quantum? Americans don't talk like that. In Europe they do. Tudors, Windsors, and the like, all intermarrying in order to keep the royal commode within the family. But in America we don't talk like that, except when it comes to American Indians. Then we talk about blood quantum. How much Indian are you? Personally, my total Indian blood quantum is 9/64. That is 1/64 more than 1/8. I know several members of my tribe whose blood quantum is higher than mine. Some, like me, spend years serving on committees while others just sit there with their hands out. Am I less a member of the tribe for having a lower blood quantum, or more a member of the tribe for having given thousands of hours of service to the tribe? Neither matters, because tribal membership is more about inheritance than it is about blood and service. Blood plays a role, but only in the public mind does it play a major role. Legally, blood is just the starting point. After that, it's about inheritance, because we are all members of families whose ancestors lived here long ago and entered into government-to-government negotiations that endure to this day. In the 19th century, there were discussions in Washington, D.C. about how to get rid of Indians. Slaughter was an option, and some thugs, like Andrew Jackson, preferred that method. Jackson, by the way, abused his office as president to rip off the American people almost as badly as he did Indians, but that's a story for another time. Fortunately for me, the American people were, for the most part, above committing mass murder, and so the leaders of the 1800s had to come up with alternative methods. One was to use blood quantum to get rid of Indians. If you were full-blooded, you were a savage Indian. This, by the way, is where the Chinook jargon word Siwash comes from. It's a corruption of sauvage, or savage. If you were half-blood, then you were a half-breed Indian. If you were 1/4, then you were almost a white man, or whatever. If you were 1/8 or less, then you were a white man or whatever, with a magical connection to nature and the spirit world, and the descendant of an Indian princess. Yeah, right. But you were no longer an Indian. They even wrote that into law, which is why you have tribes today who are desperately trying to pressure my tribe into taking their cast-off youth, because they have blood quantum requirements and we do not. Tribes with large reservations in eastern Washington, some that are measured in thousands of square miles, are sending members into our tribal meetings to demand that we open our rolls to accept their cast-off youth. And our initial reservation is less than 200 acres of land that we bought. They're doing this because they're constrained by 19th century laws and weighted down by progressives who think in terms of government solutions to poverty, which only invites poverty. As Margaret Thatcher said, the problem with socialism is that eventually you run out of other people's money. She was right. So they keep throwing away young people whose blood quantum is too low. They cast them out. My tribe, on the other hand, is more like the Tulalip, Jamestown, Sklallam, and Snoqualmie. We think more in terms of free markets, and several of our members are entrepreneurs. And instead of burdening everybody with big government that spreads poverty, we want to lift our members and local communities in prosperity. Rather than change to leverage their own considerable tribal assets to become prosperous themselves, these other tribes are trying to pressure us to absorb their own cast-off youth, the way Mexico does with the United States. Rather than changing to allow Mexico to become a prosperous nation, the Mexican oligarchs maintain a tight grip while sending their cast-offs across the border to survive as illegal immigrants in El Norte. The concept of blood quantum is a holdover of a 19th century political policy to exterminate Indians through more or less peaceful assimilation, and it's racist. In their excellent book, Family Fortunes, Bill Bonner and his son, Will Bonner, outline how families become wealthy and then maintain that wealth for generations. There's an old saying about going from rags to riches back to rags in just 3 generations. A poor man struggles, works hard, gets rich, passes his wealth on to the 2nd generation, which maintains but doesn't increase the fortune, and then the 3rd generation fritters it away. But some families manage to maintain their wealth for hundreds of years. In the book, what the Bonners describe could be called a tribe. Tribes are communities of loosely related families who work together for mutual benefit. They are not a commune, they're not socialists. Individuals can and do own property. In fact, before the coming of the white man, members of my tribe did own property. Note, there is some disagreement over this. The archaeological and anthropological evidence supports the thesis that Indians of western Washington state lived in almost libertarian communities. Cultural evidence, on the other hand, supports the contention that there was a Greater Salish nation comprised of 18 Salish tribes, and that the last of the great Salish chieftains, or Tyyees, is buried in Puyallup, and that he was known as Tyee Dick. I subscribe to the theory that the truth probably lies somewhere in between, and that the evidence is clear that there were Tyees, or head men and head women, who owned their own longhouses. Getting back to the Bonners' book about intergenerational wealth, what they describe are tribes infused with a particular culture. Today, there are Indian tribes that are adopting similar values and virtues to increase their wealth and spread prosperity throughout their communities, both Indian and local. Let me think. The Mississippi Choctaw are doing that. You can also find people on YouTube who are spreading exactly the same kind of ideas. One of my favorites is Chris Dewayne. Chris is best known for his video series on silver and his standalone videos about stacking silver. But his Sons of Liberty Academy is all about establishing post-collapse communities that are, in every respect, tribes. Tribes have a legitimate place in modern American society. In America, the oldest tribes are American Indian tribes, and I am a member of one. But there are others known by names such as Rockefeller, Rothschild, Kennedy, and perhaps newer ones like Gates. While 19th century political policy has caused Americans to think that the American Indian tribes must be comprised of people who meet blood quantum tests, the new tribes face no such constraints. And unless Americans decide to eliminate all inheritance, none of the tribes, Indian and otherwise, should. In a future video, I'll explain why progressives have spent generations driving a wedge between American Indian tribes and conservatives, and why there is and ought to be a natural alliance between both communities. For the Backlash at Backlash.com, and for the twink stomping around upstairs, My name is Rod Van Mechelen.